Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. I came to the subject of international news flow through a different direction. I studied the search engine's bias, the way Google and Google News in particular produce different picture of the world. But I'm also interested in the way nations see each other, and this is also part of the project. And the story I would like to tell you today is a particular story of the Americanization and how people see the United States through this perspective. And I will start with a non-traditional way of presentation because I will start with the methods. I think you will be interested in it. And most of the stuff that I will talk today is published in a book that I wrote, and it was published half a year ago, International News Flow Online, and is based on a software which I built that collects data similar to the projects of the GeoMedia, based on RSS of about 60 news websites that belong either to traditional printing news media or broadcast media or aggregators like Google News in different countries in 12 languages. I chose the languages that are more prominent, people talk more. So there is English and there is Chinese, there is Arabic, French, and Russian, Spanish, of course, etc. But also some languages that were more interesting for me, in particular topics that I'm looking into, like I chose Persian, I chose Hebrew, and I chose Switzerland in all the three languages. And there is always this division of news categories, which also helped me to distinguish. I ask the same questions like Dennis Wu asked in his previous papers, and his papers inspired me later to conduct more rigorous studies on this field. And the way it looks in the system is like this. You get the news, you get the description based on RSS, and then you get extraction of the countries automatically. I built dictionaries with the help of linguists of all the country names and their abbreviations in those 12 languages, so we can get automatically the country names, and then we can validate those data with human coders to see that it's the right ratio. So the system automatically finds those country names and put it in the country mentions. For example, the first one, US challenges China's claim of islands with a maritime operation. The computer knows that there are two countries in this item, and it can also link those countries together. So then when we try to, this is what Claude called the abstract data, and we try to find out what is the meanings of those patterns. And first is the pattern of America prominence in the world, but also why is it prominent, and maybe a little bit I will talk about what kind of content the news write about America in different countries, and if it is good, positive or negative, and why. It's kind of inspired by the book that some of you might know of the journalist and scholar Jeremy Tunstall, that the media are American in 1977, which means that there is a lot of production of American content in other countries, in the TV, but also in the news. And then 30 years later, the media were American, where he claims that there is very much regionalization and production of regional products in different countries, including Mexico or China or Nigeria, etc. So how is it resonated in the news? In particular in the online news, because all the news that I check is online. And then you could see definitely a very typical case that kind of resonate the study in 2000, that the US is the second most prominent country. What you see here is the news from the US, and then what countries it's mentioned. The news from the UK, what countries it's mentioned, etc. The US is most of the time the second most mentioned country, or the first foreign countries mentioned, apart from two very interesting cases where you can, somebody sees? France and Japan. And maybe it's not coincident. I did, this data is from 2009 and I did it for 2016, and it remains the same. The US is the first country in Japan and the third country in France, but also in Arabic news and in Egypt, it's relatively less prominent. And the fact that in Japan, but also in Germany, two opponents of the Second World War to the US, it's first, and then they don't mention their country so often, has certain meaning, I would say, specifically when you see this pattern for a longer period. And we will get into it a bit later. And then you see something that is quite stable along the years. I did a study looking at the trends since the 50s till today, 60 years of news, looking at what changed in terms of the country mentions. For that, of course, I had to download the archives of LexisNexis, the printed news. And then I could see that the US remained very high in the ranking, and all the rest of the countries are much lower. China is the second, and then you see several other countries. But it's interesting that in terms of region, over the time there is a change where European countries, Asian countries, and Middle Eastern countries become a little bit similar in terms of prominence. If you take out the US, because it kind of masks the results, you would see three levels, apart from China that picks up here, three levels of coverage. Here you see what Denis called the core countries, mostly countries that have a very important economic influence, Western Europe, but also in the book I call it the bad guys. It's changing all the time. It's a country that kind of now it's particularly relevant to the news, but 10 years ago it was not. And then you see here Middle Eastern, Asian, and other European countries, but also Asian centers of economic centers. I told you before that I looked at the interaction, why some countries are mentioned with other countries and how. And then you could see this network analysis of co-mentioned, country co-mentioned. When China and the US are mentioned together, then they have a link. And when we have 1 million of news items, we can make a certain map. And you see that it's hard to realize anything in this map, because it's like the solar system. You have a sun. Everything is about the US, and the US is in every interaction. And we're talking about different countries and languages, yes? But also there are certain clusters. You see here the European cluster with the bad guys. You could see the Middle Eastern cluster that starts to be built, and the Asian cluster. The amazing thing about it is that once you omit the US from the analysis, then the computer does something that is extremely reasonable. I mean, the news produces us a map, a descriptive map of the world, and all those clusters are automatically computed by the software to different colors, which are identical to the original clusters of the world. So there is something about the US that is still extremely much present in the news around the world. Now, going further to following the steps of the previous studies of Denis Wu, to look at the different dimensions, explaining dimensions. So here I would go a step backwards to think when you were children, and there was this kid that in the class that was the most they got the most attention to. Why people give attention to somebody? Either because they're big, they're strong, they're noisy, or because we have some relation to these people, we want to. We have some interest with those people. Or because they fell, they broke an arm, something happened to them. And I would try to look at this holistic approach here. We have countries that are strong, rich, powerful, big in terms of size. We have countries that our country is interested in because we are close to geographically, because we have certain ties, because of our colonial past, because we have war with them. And we have events that are not always related to, these countries were not related to, but there was an earthquake, there was a nuclear power explosion, and we were interested in the region. Then it becomes, of course, relevant to us. There is always the interaction between those things. So I took some of the variables that were in the literature and other variables that were not, about 50 variables, but I will present here only the most meaningful ones in each group. And you would see that here, this in the first group, there is economic power, but also military power and the geographical size of a country. In the second, there is political tension, conflicts between countries, but also economic trades, foreign population changes, or shared population between countries, and geographical factors. And then there is the event, which are also different factors. And you could see that in all the different languages and countries that produce online news, it's a systematic pattern that there is a strong correlation between the economic factors, and this is something that was found all over the years, at least since 1950. And then in terms of event, the conflict is very important predictor. But when you try to make a regression, a combination of all the stuff, and then I make the algorithm that make all the possible combinations of variables available in a regression model. It's many, so a human cannot do it alone. But then you see a very fascinating pattern that in all countries, the first is economic, GDP. The second is not economic, it's foreign population, because when you put trade and GDP together, they are intercorrelated. But when you put foreign population, it's not correlated. So the first factor comes from the economy, the second comes from this social aspect, and the third, the third is the conflict, the event, the time, how much the country is, the GPI is a global peace index, how much it is in a conflict with other countries. This led me to develop the more general theoretical model, which is called the group sphere model, where you have two dimensions. The first is the dimension of the sphere. We have the economic sphere, we have the social religious sphere, and we have the political sphere. And the group of explanations based on the literature, the national trait, how much the country is big and strong, the relatedness, how this country is related to us, and the event. And you see that in all countries separately, you get into this combination that the economic power comes from national trait, the social relatedness is the second dimension, and the political is related to the event. So now when we understand why countries are prominent in the news, we can go further to what is the impact of this to us. In this study, I asked people to give me all the country names that they can recall. And I compared it with the prominence of these countries in the news. I did it in 4 countries, in the US, in China, in Switzerland, and in Israel. and it was all identical. Here you see only the results of the Americans, where there is a 0.7 correlation between the ranking of countries in the memories and in the news. But the most interesting parts that I put here is the outliers, right? You could see that people recall countries that are closer to them geographically, Canada, Mexico, and didn't recall countries that were very prominent in the news at that time, but not enough during the Arab Spring, Bahrain and Libya. The other one is going a little bit deeper to understand the content about American news that mention the US. So here we analyzed in this particular study manually, but we also developed a tool to do it automatically for specific cases. How negative or positive the news in different countries about the US were. Okay? And we compared it with public opinion of people to the US. And here also we can see a slightly less strong correlation, but still a positive correlation, where where countries that was covered in a positive context, the US was covered in a positive context, people also have more positive views about these countries and the opposite. Yes, and there is also here outliers, and particularly interesting are Germany and Japan, which took totally different course. And if we will have time, I will try to interpret it later. I will summarize it. This is the attempt to make in one slide the story of all the components. How does it work? All the process. So we have certain world events, and that they can influence the way they are covered in the news in two ways. There is the prominence of the countries, and there is also the framing, how the country is covered. And the prominence of the country depends very much on the power and size of this country, but also, to a lesser extent, to the relatedness of the country and to the political events that the country experiences, particularly war. These variables are always in interaction with each other, where the more powerful the country is, the more the other things will be connected. And this, of course, affects the way we recall those countries. But here, the relatedness works stronger than not then, but the same like the national trait. So countries that is related to us, we will recall it more, even if in the news it was not so strong, like in the case of Mexico and Canada. In terms of framing, we see that relatedness is much stronger, and here is your question about the history. We see that historical patterns have very strong influence on the way the countries are covered in the news, but also perceived by us later. And there is, and this is a different study that, if you want, I will talk about also a feedback. So if we perceive a country negatively, particularly in economic news, it will affect the way it is also developing economically, and all the cycle goes back. So this is an attempt to show how everything is wrapped together. Yeah. So thank you very much.
It's not a question, it's a proposal.
Yeah.
As I'm very slow, before the Geomedia project, I had a European project called Eurobroadmap. It was with a large survey in the region of the world by students in many countries. And we asked the question, what are the 5 countries where you would like to live, and the 5 countries where you would not like to live. So typically this survey gives you an indication on how students from India, for example, know or ignore the country, and has a positive or negative balance. And I'm convinced that you will be happy to compare with
Absolutely. This kind of stuff is what I'm looking at now more.
Okay.
I'm more interested in the national image of countries and how different countries perceive each other with relation to media, but not absolutely. You know, when we hear that social media gets stronger, then we're interested also to look at the content of social media.
And the survey was done in 2008, just before the junk of the world crisis. So
Mhm.
it's historical data,
Yeah,
but it is at the disposal of people interested.
excellent.
Other questions? Otherwise, I've got a curiosity about Germany and Japan. You said
Okay.
that there's a difference.
Yes, here I showed you how it's not exactly how critical the content is about the US, because this would ask a much deeper understanding of the language. What we did was classifying the content of news about the US based on certain criteria. If the content of the news was about war, about killing, about things that are negative, or about development, cooperation, stuff like this. And then we saw that there is a correlation between positive context of the news that the US is mentioned and the positive opinion about the US. And we see here that Japan has more positive coverage of the US, which affects the way it is also perceived by the Japanese, while the Germans have a very negative context in which the US is mentioned, and the people are also, it corresponds the public opinion of the Germans. Now, when we go earlier to try to understand why the US is mentioned more in Japan and Germany, I would say that it's a question of understanding historically the most significant power to the shaping of their country in Japan and in Germany. And therefore the attention goes there. But also the shyness to be national, to celebrate your nationalism until recently, very recently, when it's just but totally different way to approach it in Japan and in Germany, a Western and a more Eastern way to approach to deal with the history.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.